Hello and welcome to Data Troll. Today I'd like to talk about a clean tech issue, or clean tech related issue, and that's climate change. Um, Climate change is actually one of the strongest driving reasons for the clean tech sector, as it's very important for us to basically find a way to generate energy while minimizing greenhouse gases as much as possible and therefore minimizing climate change. And, recently I was thinking about the cost of climate change, but not the usual costs that we talk about, like physical costs, like, look where the glaciers are melting, or, animals are going extinct, or economic costs, such as, wow, this is going to cost, this country, $50 trillion by 2050. Just an example figure, but we hear these kind of talks of cost often. But another important cost that I don't think we hear about usually is social and political costs. And what kind of got me to start thinking about this was I was reading an article on it, and they were quoting an expert, and the expert said that basically the impacts of climate change are upon us, and that when people see those impacts, they will be firsthand. They will be shocked, first, at the impacts themselves, and also how little the governments really try to prepare them for this. And that got me thinking, how will climate change affect people's attitude towards government? And so I started thinking about historical events to see if there was any kind of hint. And one, I think, potential kind of scenario could be the same as a very recent economic crisis that we had in 2008, which was the Great Recession. So for those who need a refresher on what happened there, basically around 2008, American banks started, and American financial lenders started basically selling investments based on very bad mortgage loans. And it created a housing bubble, but eventually, of course, these loans collapsed. There were a lot of foreclosures, and this basically caused a whole economic recession around the world, led governments to create austerity measures, and caused basically a lot of social problems. And so basically, that was caused by a group of, as I said, Wall Street, American bank leaders and financial lenders. Now, what made this worse was, I think, the American government's response to it. Because basically, the U.S. government responded by bailing out the very people responsible for it, providing them financial support, without ever actually making sure that they paid any consequences for it. This group, basically, very few of them, I don't think, almost none of them went to jail. They all basically kept their jobs, and lots of them, kept their bonuses. And ironically, the people who paid the price were people who were less responsible for this mess. The average citizen who would see, maybe their economic livelihood hurt, maybe they lose a job, maybe they'd see their house values drop, they would see these kind of things. And basically, the American government's response was not to help the average citizen, but to bail out the people responsible. So, not surprisingly, this created a lack of trust, or eroded trust in the U.S. government, and I think leaders in general in the U.S. system, as well as in the world. Because to respond to this economic crisis, the governments, both in the U.S. and elsewhere, introduced austerity measures, basically cutting back benefits, which just made the situation even worse. So as a result, people started to see this as, these political systems and economic systems as less and less fair and more corrupt. So, for instance, what made it look really bad was you had, these financial leaders who were kind of very, financial lenders, Wall Street, etc., who were very, survival of the fittest capitalism, until they started losing money, and then suddenly they were happily out there taking government money. And so people started to see capitalism as more corrupt or crony. So the end result, I feel, one of the impacts of this was that it eroded the trust people had in their governments. So I think that in climate change, we may see the same thing. Basically, when people start to see the impacts of this and realize that the governments knew about this and took no real significant measures to minimize it or just straight out lied about it, I don't think they will have the same trust levels in the government. And this is actually really bad because to respond to climate change effectively, we need to take collective action. But if the less people trust in their government, the less collective action the government can organize for these kind of issues. So, often scientists are warning the politicians and leaders of society about here are the potential economic fiscal costs of climate change. But I think it's also important for these leaders to consider that when these impacts happen and people start getting desperate and scared, will they actually have the credibility to lead anymore? Will people listen to them? I think that's a very important impact. So to close, I think we really need to worry about what climate change could do to not just our economy, not just the world, but also in our ability for governments to actually have the credibility to organize and lead societies. Anyways, that was my thought. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them below. And thank you for joining Data Troll. And if you like it, please give a like and a subscribe. Thanks. Have a good day.